Hello, I'm Robert Brunson, a lawyer in Charleston, South Carolina at Nelson Mullins, Raleigh, and Scarborough. Joining me today on the Probate Litigator blog is Dr. Linda Austin, noted psychiatrist for over 30 years in Charleston and also in Portland, Maine. Dr. Austin, thank you for joining us. Today we're going to talk about what to look for, how to know if your relative, typically a parent, is vulnerable to and is being unduly influenced by someone else to do something that's against their free will. Now, let me start by saying the legal definition of undue influence is really rather vague. Basically, in order to establish that someone undertook an action which was caused by the undue influence of another person, you have to show that the other person overtook the free will of the victim. Now, scholars have debated whether free will even exists for, millennia. But the law nonetheless requires proof that the free will of a person has been overtaken, and so that their actions are not their own, but are in fact the actions of the undue influencer. Dr. Austin, from the standpoint of a psychiatrist or psychologist, what should a person look for to know if dad is vulnerable or if dad is actually being unduly influenced by a perpetrator?
Robert, I'm going to address this not only from the point of view of a psychiatrist, but from the experience I've had watching my elderly parents and parents-in-law go through this, because I think you do gain real insight when you actually live this on a daily basis. We think of dementia as an umbrella term. It's a description of a person who has a chronic, progressive, it's never static, it's a progressive state in which their brain function basically diminishes. And what doctors typically do in their office to determine if somebody has dementia is what we call a mini mental status exam, which more or less looks at memory functions. But dementia is much more than just difficulty with memory. Some of the first things that you will see in your loved one is that they just lose their sense of independence. Maybe mom was always one who could put together a great meal, and now she can't really follow a recipe very well. Or maybe dad always had a hobby of woodworking, and now even making a little jewelry box or something that once was very easy is difficult. There can often be personality changes. So someone who once was feisty and independent becomes very dependent and submissive. And so when you start to see those kinds of changes, those are some of the early signs of dementia. And in my experience, often it's that passivity or submissiveness or just unwillingness to be bothered with daily stuff that can make that person become very dependent on a caretaker or somebody else who then may become an influencer in an undue influence case.
Some of these things seem rather obvious, but in some cases, is a person able to mask the extent to which they are impaired by dementia?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And especially, I think I've seen situations where the doctor will say, well, gosh, they were able to tell me who the president was, and they're able to name their children, and they're able to do those certain things that are memory functions. And yeah, the older people can sometimes even study up for the mini mental status test and do quite well on it, but that belies what's really going on underneath it, where on a day-to-day basis, maybe they're napping for large portions of the day, or they don't have the concentration to be able to read a legal document, and they start handing over those very important tasks to people outside themselves.
Dr. Austin, in our first installment of this three-part series, you talked about the pillars of undue influence, and one of those was the use of tactics. That the perpetrator, which could be a spouse, could be a girlfriend or boyfriend or caretaker, or could just be a neighbor, but they use certain strategies and tactics in order to overtake the will of the vulnerable person. Could you talk a little bit about what that means?
Sure. Well, Robert, not only do we live in an era in which people are living to very advanced ages, but we live in a society in which there may be great physical distance between folks. So a natural, normal, healthy relationship with a loving spouse of someone becoming demented or a caretaker, as that person would maybe say to the son or daughter, gosh, your dad would love to see you. Let's arrange for a visit. Why don't you come and see your dad? Or let me put him on the phone. What happens in undue influence, though, is the opposite often. And I think it's one of those red flags that something's going on, where visits are discouraged, where the older person becomes more and more isolated and more dependent on just that primary relationship with the one person who is the influencer.
And what type of person would fit the profile of an undue influencer?
Well, somebody who would benefit from, let's say, a windfall, somebody who has a history of relationships that are manipulative, somebody who has maybe a history with the, let's say, stepchildren that is very contentious and difficult. That is, let's say, that would be in a second or third marriage case where, dad is the one with the money and the kids never really got along with their stepmother. That's a pretty vulnerable kind of situation that one should be concerned about and just be aware of.
Dr. Austin, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to the third installment in this three-part blog series. And the next one will focus on what do you do if you think dad is being unduly influenced by a third party. I look forward to speaking with you then. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.